Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, perhaps. We want to thank you for joining the Partnership for Public Service at our second Author Talks event. My name is Emma Shirazzo-Allman. I'm an Associate Manager at the Tech and Innovation team under the Partnership for Public Service, and I have the immense pleasure to welcome our speaker, Cyd Harrell, the author of a Civic Technologist practice guide. Before more thoroughly introducing our speaker, a few housekeeping notes. We invite you to use the Zoom chat function to communicate with panelists and audience members, but please use the Q&A feature to submit a question for the open portion of the event. And you'll see that there is a fireside chat 3-question poll. Please take a moment to complete that. It'll help frame our conversation. That said, we want to thank Cyd Harrell joining us from the West Coast. She is a user experience or UX researcher, service and product designer and director. And if you've seen her website or Twitter, you would know also a skilled poet. She has supported government across levels and sectors, including serving as the chief of staff for the General Service Administration's Digital Services Consultancy, 18F, consulting for several years with the Judicial Council of California, and most recently serving on the board of directors for Technologists for the Public Good. Her book, A Civic Technologist Practice Guide, released in 2020, is an onboarding guide and survival manual to the civic technology field that, unlike most manuals I've encountered, is clear, not cumbersome, spirited rather than staid, and, as she says in her book, shows what's possible and does what's necessary to foreground this field. And it prepares individuals at any age and stage. Here to moderate a discussion on that book and civic tech is Mark Lerner, who leads the partnership's federal technology strategy and programs. He's served in private, public, and academic positions, including completing a tour with the U.S. Digital Service and as a New America Fellow. Mark and Cyd, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Emma. Cyd, it's great to have you here and good to get some time to chat with you.
It is so great to be here. It's nice to see you again.
Likewise. One quick note for folks, as I'm going through, again, please feel free to type in the chat, drop some questions that you have in the Q&A feature. We will be saving some time for Q&A from you all. So, but first, I have the pleasure of being able to ask my own questions, which I'm very excited to do. Cyd, I love your book. I have a well-worn copy of it on my shelf. I keep it with me. I refer to it frequently. You can see there are a lot of dog ears in the book. And lots of notes in it. So it is something that I refer to quite frequently. And in particular, I've been referring to it recently because we're taking on a challenge here at the partnership. One of the things that we've been thinking about a lot at the partnership is finding a way to define the problem that we're trying to solve. This is in the context of sort of technology, innovation, modernization, and government, right? Now, in the civic, small subject for sure. Right. In the civic tech space in general, it's easy to point to many individual instances, a healthcare.gov, for instance, or a Clear My Record, or sort of like, this is the problem, and here's the tools that we use to solve it. But that's separate from articulating the core root problem that the movement as a whole, that civic technologists are working to solve. And I wanted to pose it to you and see, how you might be able to frame that problem, particularly given how you did so in the book or how you approached it in the book.
It's a great question, and my answer is probably a little bit biased by my design background. But I think the problem is that government, in some ways, isn't meeting the public where the public is. And technology has proved to be a tool which does not always, right, but can be incredibly useful for meeting various audiences or constituencies or customer bases, or however you want to think about the people who are using something where they are. So for me, you mentioned I've been working in the courts recently, and for example, remote hearings in courts were not terribly common prior to the pandemic and suddenly became much more common during the pandemic. People have been trying to do nudge style interventions and policy interventions for a long time to get more people to the court dates they're supposed to have. Interestingly, when more remote hearings became available, more people showed up. So there's some starting evidence that making a channel of interaction available that is more convenient to people, bracketing, of course, that it isn't more convenient to everybody, but a significant number of people, actually accomplishes some of what we're trying to do through motivation and so forth. And so the idea that the government is kind of leaving on the table things that they could use to better meet the public's needs in an efficient and effective and democratic way, I think that's the problem that we want to solve.
I love that framing. And it actually leads very easily into the next one, which is, so to do that, to be
Right.
able to actually address the needs of the public in the way that they need it, and to meet them where they are, especially now in this digital era. You and I have this understanding, and you again speak about it a lot in the book, that we need to include technologists, software engineers, designers, product managers, and that encompasses a lot of different kinds of skills and competencies.
Yeah.
In government, when we think about tech, it's usually cybersecurity, cloud, DevOps, tech procurements,
Right.
and
IT stuff. Sometimes I
IT.
contrast IT and tech.
Yes,
because I think there are things that people take on self-consciously that mean different things.
Exactly. And so I was wondering how you might be able to, how do we come to that shared understanding of like, no, yes, we're technologists and we're using tech, but we're actually talking about solving human problems, and not having people just like, oh, you're IT, this is IT, let's bucket you over here.
I think it's one of the fundamental issues for the field, right? In a company that thinks of itself as a tech company, of course, tech is part of its primary business, even though it's usually solving, some other problem, like I need to get, whatever book I want downloaded to my device. But in a mission-driven organization, tech usually isn't part of the core mission, and it can be both seen as and structured as a subordinate function. And so you tend to get two things. You tend to get, those tech people are subordinate, we tell them what to do and they should do it. Or you also tend to get sometimes an idea that tech is really special and really magic and a special skill that our typical program staff don't need to have. Now, I'll say I am on the side of the argument, everybody does not need to learn to code. I don't code myself, except for some 90s HTML skills, whatever. But a fundamental comfort level that technology is something that you can see working with, and that you have some basic idea of how it works, and really how you might use the material of digital or the material of technology or the material of web to accomplish a constituent goal, is really, really useful to have within a leadership team or within a project team. And so separating that out from where we talk about program goals can mean that you get this separation, and you don't end up having as good outcomes.
And we had this conversation very recently about leadership in government, on including more of these technologists, this perspective, in their decision-making processes, in their prioritization. It's not an easy thing, and it's something that doesn't happen, I think, often enough. And one of the barriers that I have seen with that is leaders in government that are not technologists, nor do they have any requirement to be.
Right.
Maybe don't even
they probably
have,
shouldn't be spending their time on that, right? Yeah.
Right, exactly. But in a way that also means that they don't necessarily have the right questions to ask.
Yeah.
So how might you advise a cohort of government leaders, for instance, who are not themselves technologists, on how to approach technical experts, how to bring them in so that we can bring this skill set to the table, as you were saying?
Yeah, it's interesting that you want to balance, right? You want to bring them in with respect for the skills that they do have, but you don't want to bring them in as, special wizards who should overrule your career staff because they know how to do innovation. One of the interesting things that I have seen in some strategic work we did with California a couple of years ago, that's published as California Vision 2023, was that agencies that placed their top technology person as part of their actual leadership council saw a lot of benefit from that. Rather than having that particular, whatever the chief level was, that particular director, a sort of step below the other people on the leadership level. So just bringing somebody who was going to be alert to the possibilities of technology for a program goal to those top level discussions as a starting point really made a difference in what they were able to carry forward.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense then of like, at that stage, if there's anything regarding, this is something that I've run into a little bit, like specific people and the personalities in the room versus like the competencies that sort of
Yeah.
can apply to multiple different kinds of folks. Is that something that you have seen in those particular cases, for instance?
Well, I'm very aware that technologists like myself who come from the private sector can walk into a government room and take up a lot of space and be basically arrogant jerks, and act as if, you hear it all the time, right? Well, Google can do this. Can't we just bring in a couple Google people and get it done? And there's that person needs to bring their knowledge, but also recognize that there's a pretty significant difference in environments that a government agency hasn't spent the last 30 years really focused on its technological maturity. And it probably shouldn't spend all of its focus on its technological maturity, but we might want to move it forward somewhat. I think you see problems, for example, like wanting to graft very modern tech methods directly onto a government agency, and they're methods that depend on there existing a bunch of tech precursors. So,
Yeah.
if I am Amazon, I have data centers, I have a strong release process practice, I have
An
QA that
army.
tests things, I have an army of designers, I have
Yeah.
metrics already instrumented on everything down to the code. I have been search engine optimizing my web pages for decades. And so if I try and say, oh, Amazon does this and they do it really well, let's bring this over to a government agency where we've never search engine optimized our pages. So we can put some analytics on and say, oh, well, these are the top trafficked pages. That might not mean the same thing it means when something is a top trafficked page on a site that has really been optimized already. And so there's a sort of set of steps back we need to take.
Yeah.
If we don't have the ability to correct a typo in the course of a day on our website, probably a modern DevOps practice is not the top thing we need.
Right, absolutely. Are there other examples, either of practices or even particular use cases where rather than going for the like, we need to, be exactly like these massive companies, instead it's sort of like, let's do what we can do, steps forward, right?
I mean, we've been honestly following this a lot in my work with the California courts, where we've actually got a little metaphor for ourselves, is that we're starting with a paper atlas in terms of what somebody can find out about how to pursue their own civil case in the courtroom. And we can envision a world that, is all the way at ways where everything is fed to me and the data flows between the state level and the specific court that I'm working with and me and the other party. And we don't really have the underpinnings to do that. So what we decided in our team was that it's okay if we step from the paper atlas to MapQuest. Hopefully there's some few people who remember MapQuest from the 90s and early 2000s, but if we step from there to MapQuest, we're making a big advance for the people using the court system. So the first thing that we built has a lot to do with just very simplified step-by-step instructions with branching paths for how to request a restraining order, how to respond to an eviction notice, how to pursue a custody change, all those kinds of things. And we are just getting to the point now after 3 years where we're looking at, okay, well, how can we incorporate information from the local courts about specific details of procedure that are relevant?
It's so fascinating because the challenges that I have run into myself when trying to tackle in my case, immigration processes, were just as much about how you present things to the external user as it is about what's the internal process that we
Right.
use to go about it. And I imagine that the court cases follow a very similar pattern.
Yes.
Um, are there changes to like policies or changes to how, things that are not like, for instance, we have this new customer experience executive order, which I think is
Right.
very
It's really
powerful and
interesting. Yeah.
very effective. But it's not the same as saying like we need to rethink our government to be service oriented. We need to be focused on changing all of our processes so that it actually makes sense for the external user.
Right. We're sort of saying we're going to help you more with our possibly
Exactly.
difficult processes, right?
Exactly. And so I was just curious if you, particularly given that you have eyes on the state level and local level and quite a lot of different places, if you've seen efforts that have been successful in changing some of those policies to make, again, what our goal as a civic tech movement to make that,
And
come to
more.
life.
Um, I think there are some interesting small ones. I'm thinking about, I of course watched the vaccine registration sites last year, like something of a hawk, because it was
Uh-huh.
a service that
Uh-huh.
had to be hastily developed and had to be really robust. And you saw some, they started out terrible. And most of the problem was, in fact, not that the websites were terrible, it was that there simply wasn't any supply of vaccines. And so, however difficult it was to go through the process, you'd reach an endpoint where it's like, sorry, we don't have an appointment for you. But they got better. And as they got better, they started to incorporate little policy tweaks. For example, I live in San Francisco, which was extremely pro-vaccine. And one of the policies here was that teenagers could self-consent. So we'd really
Oh.
prefer you bring a parent with you. But
Mm-hmm.
if you can't, we'll go ahead. And so they
Wow.
changed a step in the registration process so that it didn't require a parent to do it in order to enable that and to assure a kid who wanted to do it and might not have permission that they could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, I also think election policy, which I think this is more led by Washington, but and Colorado, but California is the one I've experienced that has started default sending people voter guides or default sending people ballots
Mm-hmm.
after seeing the difficulties that people have with request processes or with accessing those things as an example of that, although not an incredibly technical one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, yeah. I want to come back to the book for a quick second because there's something that I really would love to touch on, which is you note in the book that there is a sort of 2-year time frame for
Minimum.
making some of these
Yeah,
minimum for making these sorts of
right,
changes. And in talking about things like building out the vaccine website, that's not just something that someone did, that's built on a huge foundation that came
right.
before it, right?
Yeah, and cities and states that had strong digital teams were generally a lot faster out of the gate, although there was a great vendor built site in Indiana that which doesn't have a ton of civic tech
Mhm.
active initiatives.
Really curious. I would love to see a case study about that because,
I will
if
see
you
if I
can
can
do it
dig that
without,
link up for you.
yeah, if we can find out what they did without having sort of like the influx of the community, well, and that can be something that can be replicated.
So, actually, one of the things, and I think I may make this point in another way in the book, is that with all of the healthcare exchanges at the state
Mhm.
level, when the launch of the Affordable Care Act, um, even though CGI Federal were the people whose launch failed with healthcare.gov, they actually also supported one of the most successful launches, which was Kentucky's Connect, which was unfortunately taken out of service by an administration that didn't favor it a few years later. But it was one of the best launches. And I was at Code for America at the time, and we called up and said, what did you all do? Do you have tech
Mhm.
experts on staff? And they said, no, we don't really have tech experts, but what we did was we worked really closely with our
Mhm.
program folks and CGI's tech folks. And in fact, we embedded them part of the time so that we were sitting
Mhm.
next to each other. And we met, 3 times a week. We didn't
Hmm.
just let the project go roll off on its own. So
Hmm.
there's a way in which even attentive management by people who really understand the mission goal and can keep asking the question, how does this piece of tech serve the mission goal, can do a lot to start to push you down the
Hmm.
road.
Yeah, I love that because it really shows that it's not just about you have to be a technologist to understand how this works and such. It's about just being using modern management skills,
Right.
right? And
And I think,
effective management
I mean,
skills.
one of the biggest characteristics of a technologist is that they're not scared of technology.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
You
That's a
know,
huge point.
if
Yeah.
you really feel like you can work with technology and it's something that you can take charge of,
Hmm.
then whatever skill set you have, you're probably a technologist.
Love that. On a meta level, coming back to
Yeah.
this sort of minimum 2-year time frame.
Sorry,
No, no,
I
no, no, no. This is
digressed.
great. No, no, absolutely. You're on the exact right track, which is, you need to build a strong foundation for a lot of these things.
Yeah.
However, we have seen a lot of different elements of different efforts, I should say, that are bringing people in for short periods of time, tours of service, right? I myself came into federal government at the U.S. Digital Service, which was saying, come in for 6 months to 4 years. I planned to
Right.
stay for 1 year and ended up staying 4 and a bit and
I
had
did
to
2 years at
out.
18F myself.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so there's this whole, um, the way that the federal government, at least, and I'm sure other governments are following, are approaching talent is, well, let's just get them for a short period of time and bring them in, which is counter to what you're saying here, which is like you really got to be in there 2 years minimum to be able to actually affect change.
Right.
Do you see that there's like policies that we should be changing, or do you think that all of these efforts that are bringing people in on that short-term basis are, all for naught? Just
No,
curious to get your take.
I don't think they're all for naught, and I understand a lot of them to have to do with kind of special hiring authorities that people need to use, perhaps to bring people
Mm,
in with closer to tech industry salaries, and benefits, and to convince people who feel like they're taking time out of a career. I also
mm,
think it's a shift in the objective of the field. 10 years ago, when it was really about innovation and prototyping and showing what's possible, you can do that in 6 months for sure.
mm,
Um,
mhm,
but if you want to, actually have your innovation adopted and integrated and brought onto a production grade infrastructure so that it's really widely used, that's very, very difficult to do in 2 years if you're starting from somewhere where that doesn't already exist.
mhm, mhm. One of the things that I used to track in government when I was hiring people at USDS was this timer of it took about a year and a half before someone had gone to their first level of burnout. And I was like, okay, now you get it. Now you understand, and now you can be
Yeah.
effective. There's usually like the first wave of, I don't know how the government operates, which you have this incredible table at the start of your book that's like, you know, not a lot of people know how government is structured. Here is the entire structure, and I'm seeing if I can. Yeah,
It's
here
not
it is.
comprehensive, but hopefully it's the basics.
It's
Yeah.
incredible. I loved it when I was reading through the book. I was like, yeah, this is great. Um, so a year and a half in is usually when we're like, okay, now this person is at a solid place. Um, and yet we're seeing a lot of, again, at that local, at that state level, a lot of people who are coming in new into the space, starting up at these digital service offices, these
Yeah.
Office of Innovation and Technology or Information Technology. There's a lot of different versions of this sort of popping up. Um, and the thing that I think about a lot is that the field's only going to grow, right? Which
Yes.
is why this book
Let's
is
hope.
so effective. Is that it's, yeah, fingers crossed. It is the intro, right? Like, here's the
Right.
things you really need to know. Um, as it grows, do you think that it will change such that people don't have to go through that 2 years of like figuring it out before they can be effective?
I really hope so. I mean, I would consider it a huge win if we can get that back to under a year.
Hmm. Mm.
And it, uh, I think in technology, in shiny technology companies, right? And one thing I want to acknowledge is that The ones we tend to talk about, the well-funded startups, the Airbnbs, the Googles, those are just the golden tip of the iceberg of actual technology jobs. But in those places, right, they're assuming people are leaving jobs in 2 or 3 years because they're going to get a better offer or something's going to happen. And so they are trying to do incredibly fast onboarding. They want you effective in a couple of months. I don't know if we're going to get or we need to get all the way to that for civic technology. I mean, I'm also curious how that compares to, when you come into a non-technology role, to a mission role in a government agency, how long does it take to be effective within the power structure and to be effective at getting things done?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I would be surprised if it wasn't similar, I'll say.
Yeah.
I think that there's just a difference in expectation from folks who come from a technology background is maybe the case.
Yes, and technologists are really used to being catered to, and I don't think that means that all government needs to cater to them either.
No, for sure, for sure. Now we have this momentum that's been built up, right, with these different organizations from the outside, Code for America, New America, et cetera, from the inside, 18F, the digital service team, and I should also note many others, the lab at OPM, for instance.
All the state digital services and the sort of anchor cities, or you have Philly, Boston, San Francisco. There's more going on in LA than you hear about. They just are not as public.
I would love to hear more about what's going on in LA. Now, all that said, we have this momentum. We still haven't gotten to the place of government as a platform, for instance, or a fully modernized government. And I don't think that anyone expects that we're going to get there anytime soon.
Right.
Excuse me. In terms of sort of like the next steps to get us there, right? There's sort of like, or the most immediate steps, because it's a 10-year, 20-year, 50-year sort of plan that we have.
I often
here.
say 50, but I hope we're in like year 14 here.
Fingers crossed, fingers crossed. Which of the various different efforts that are happening right now do you see as being sort of like that's where there's a lot of promise and that's going to take us to the next stage? For instance, things like open data, decentralization of all these various teams that are happening across government, or potentially like centralized services such as a login.gov.
Yeah, I think login.gov and cloud.gov too are very interesting efforts. I don't know if either of them has been done with enough research in state and local governments to understand whether they're directly applicable. On the other hand, I'm very aware that there are about 20,000 municipalities in the United States alone. And only about 300 of those 20,000 have a population over 100,000 people. So when you think about resource levels, even toward the low end of those 100,000 person cities, their IT department is 5 people, maybe 10 people. And they still have a pretty similar expectation of the service that they might provide to someplace like Oakland or Miami. So one of the things I think about a lot lately is efforts to raise the floor. And I think that cloud.gov and login.gov are potentially interesting aspects of that. And, shared services are one thing. Government specific services are one thing, but just getting every government agency the ability to build out a website for a new program in a few days without hiring anybody would unlock all of the service innovation that those workers want to do for their constituents. And thinking about how we do that, the other sort of unshiny project fantasy that I personally have is fixing all the forms. And not necessarily by building a web form builder, but by deploying a small army of designers to help people just look at their language and their fields and their designs with the tools that people use to build paper forms. And then once we get a ways with that, it's actually going to be a lot easier to digitize them.
Yeah, I actually have a Twitter thread bookmarked, which I know that both you and I spend way too much time on Twitter.
This is true.
That is, that is all about like who's working on forms and what are they doing. And it is such a near and dear thing to my heart because absolutely it's the case. one of the reasons that I decided to go work on immigration is that my entire family is a family of immigrants, and they had to go through those forms, and it is horrendous. It's
Yeah,
not something that people can actually go through, especially when they're going through a very difficult, life stage or
transition.
moment.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I mean, you know, I have tried to do like casual back of the napkin estimates that 75% of our interactions with government include a form. And then if you want to assess the percentage of those forms that are really hard to use, it's going to be probably higher than that, right? So when
No kidding.
you pull out your multiple and you think about the aggregate amount of people's time and energy that gets used on that, especially for something where there's a long standing practice of form design. There's a lot of
Hmm.
things known about how to do it well. So even without it being digital technology, there's just an enormous amount of meeting the public better that could happen
Hmm.
through through supporting governments, or supporting people who want to help governments to do things like that. And that too is a foundation and a floor raising. It's much easier to specify a good digital tool when we're really clear about why are we asking X question, and what are the best words to use, and what languages do we need to be able to ask it in.
Hmm. I'll take a moment to pause here and just re-mention to the attendees, feel free to add in any questions that you want to ask and have answered into the Q&A function. We'll be coming up on that shortly. Um, Again, a sort of meta level question here
Yeah,
for you, Cyd. In the book, you discuss the various different parties that are involved in the development and delivery of public modern digital services, right? You've got the public servants, of which there are many different kinds and types and different branches and roles. You have the vendors
yes,
and the entire sort of vendor ecosystem. And the civic technologist kind of inhabits this special middle space or ether space, which is like sometimes you can be in it, sometimes you can be part of the vendor community, part of the government community, part of a not-for-profit
part
such
of
as
a
a partnership,
volunteer. Yep.
a volunteer organization. There's a lot of different places that it comes from. And so when we're looking at the problems such as, hey, there's how many did you say? 40 bajillion different municipalities?
20,000-ish. Yeah,
20,000-ish different municipalities. Um, and all of them need forms to be redesigned. All of them have, web features that are probably failing. All of them could probably use a text line for some service that they have, right?
absolutely. Yeah.
And yet the models by which these places can get the talent to actually do that work, the traditional way of doing so is let's go ahead and get a vendor, get a contractor, right?
Right.
Are there, with the advent of this sort of civic tech movement, are there other ways that you see these thousands of distributed smaller governments that can get access to the type of skills and the competencies that they need to be able to build better services?
This is a terrific question. One of the ways is to start including some level of technology skills in a lot of job descriptions. So, if you're an assistant city administrator at a city of 20,000 people, is it smart for you to have some level of database and web knowledge? So you might be able to do some things yourself. You might be able to hire in a really targeted and smart way. Um, a lot of what's needed isn't computer science degree level computer skills. It's
Right.
right. It's small web
Mhm.
shop computer skills. And I think there's a lot of potential for creating paths for people to train for that are community college, high school, even uh, community based. Not, I don't want to say boot camp because that's a industry thing that has a lot of issues, but training programs that are specific to that. And ways to connect those people into larger networks that can help with both advancement, professional growth, and also just offer more access to experience and so forth from people who are at it for a while. Um, I do think technology, not necessarily hands-on technology skill, but a kind of product and design modes of thought are interesting parts of modern management, I think. Product in a strategic sense of how do we want the service to operate? What do we want it to do for who? How are we going to know whether we're being successful or not? And design in, being able to articulate a strong design brief to somebody who's going to build something, which says, yes, we want it to be simple and beautiful. And what that means is we know that home broadband in our town is crummy and everybody uses their phone. So it's got to be really mobile capable. Yes, we want it to show our town spirit, but this is something in particular that people use when they're in a little bit of distress. So we're going to use a muted interface, and we're going to use really simple words because we know that people absorb simpler content better when they are in distress, and we need it to be, let's say, in Spanish and Hmong, because those are the ethnicities that are part of our community. And we really hope somebody can complete the form in under 3 minutes without getting worried. If you can articulate a design brief like that and hold a company to it, which is a management skill, you're doing the right work.
I love that, because we've been talking a lot at the partnership about what are the modern management tools, modern ways of working that we can try and instill and teach the people that come through a lot of our programming. And this isn't, we're not trying to teach people how to write algorithms or how to do a search over a binary tree, right? We're trying to teach them, how do you build a service that works best for the people that need it.
Right. And yeah, how do you know if the technology people are doing their best for you is another great one.
At the end of most services in government are people who are sort of that are interacting directly with the public, right? Yeah. We're talking about like, the people that you meet at the DMV, or we're talking about, potentially healthcare providers, or
people in the assistance center in the court who help you fill out your form.
All these various different folks. Those people are potentially the most critical ones in providing customer experience and a solid service right now. And in my view, I unfortunately think that we tend to overload them with so much emotional labor, as well as like tons of you have to be able to navigate through this entire thing effectively at the level of a lawyer. But for those people that do work directly with the public, what might be some things that they can do or that we can help them do to improve that customer experience, either in what that interaction, the person-to-person interaction looks like, or things we can gather from that interaction to improve it in a separate way?
So, I mean, in many ways, I think the best way we can help those people is try to reduce their load a little bit. They're often under just unacceptable pressure in terms of the time they have to spend with each case, maybe. And actually improving tools for those frontline or counter folks is one of the most leveraged things you can do with technology. So if they don't have to switch between 15 screens to check what happened to somebody's application, they feel a lot better about their job. They do their job a lot faster. People in those roles also tend to be able to give really cogent critiques of what they have and what problems they see people bringing in and where they're not able to help. So whenever I'm working with an agency, they're some of the people I want to talk to most. So for leaders, to make connections with those people and make space for them to say things that even may not be very positive about the things that you're providing them, that actually can do a whole lot. It's tricky because you feel sometimes like those counter people, they're kind of a level, they don't have a big picture, but they have a very specific and very human picture of what's going on. if you can, as a leader, get to shadow some of those people without them being scared and creating kind of a theater of things going great for you, you can learn a ton.
Now, those people are also sometimes, when you're introducing some larger changes to a process, sometimes those are often the folks that need to be the most bought in, right? You ideally
Yeah,
should be working with them from the very beginning to design these new processes to leverage what they know as the experts on the front lines. But if you have tens of thousands of officers that are doing the work at airports, for instance, TSA officers,
yeah,
or however you might distribute it. It's a huge community of people to shift into newer ways of working, more modern ways of working, and
right.
potentially new technologies or newly designed processes. What are some of the ways that as civic technologists we can bring in that what government might say, like, oh, this is just like a massive change management process that's going to take us 5 years to do, and we have to start here and we have to go through all these different steps. Are there other ways that we can go about doing that that might be, helpful?
It's a great question. I think a lot of people ended up shifting on a dime in the pandemic. And of course, it shouldn't require a crisis to make a change, and people shouldn't necessarily be required to change at crisis speed when it isn't. But that showed me a lot. And, courts are one of the areas of government that probably rightly are least quick to shift practices. And to adapt just because something might seem more modern. And the level of adaptation when people weren't able to be in person was really, really significant. And now, of course, in order to make some of those changes permanent, like remote hearings, it actually requires changes to rules of court, which have the force of statute and the judicial branch. So it's fairly significant. All that kind of policy work has to go back up the chain in a non-emergency mode. But I think people who see the change is going to help them may grumble, but they'll be okay. People who feel like the change is being imposed and is going to make their life worse are never going to get happy with it. And people are sometimes wrong about those things, but they're often pretty good judges of how something is actually going to affect their work life. So one of the ways to work with them is to really honor the situation that they're in and what they think about it.
Mm-hmm. I'll make a quick note again. If anyone has any other questions they want to toss in, just go ahead and toss into the chat, into the Q&A. I've got a few more questions for you, Cyd. And anyone else that wants to, have a particular question answered, just let us know. So I'll pivot a little bit. There's a section in your book that I love on innovation titled, and I quote, "Innovation is a flawed framework for change." I absolutely love this section. In particular, there's one sentence that I have deeply underlined
Oh, wow.
right down here. "The most important goal for civic programs is not that they are newer, but that they are better." I love that. Now, the chapter as a whole does challenge a lot of the structure and momentum that's currently built out, right? And you're certainly not alone in critiquing the use of innovation. The book by the folks at Public Digital also does the same thing. There's a number of other folks that consider innovation to be a sort of four-letter word. We use the term innovation here because it does have quite a lot of momentum behind it.
Right.
How do you reconcile the notion that you present here with that large amount of momentum that's going into innovation, either by people in this space or by the industry writ large?
Well, momentum in dangerous directions actually doesn't help anybody.
Mm,
So
mm,
sometimes we're kind of able to co-opt that innovation drive and turn it and make sure that it goes to the good. But um, I feel like as much as possible, we're a little too old to have things not be, strategically sound.
mhm,
Um, and things that are innovative for innovation's sake just don't always do that work of meeting the public and doing something that it needs, and as such are wasteful and frustrating and all kinds of other tough things. Innovation does sometimes seem to be easier to get funded, does seem to attract positive attention from leadership because modern always seems good. And on the other hand, I'm struck by paper ballots as an incredibly durable, useful technology. That's a little bit disingenuous in a way, because the printing technologies that we use to customize each ballot for each person, for each precinct, are pretty advanced technology, but it's not what we think of when we're talking about high technology and innovation.
Right.
And it's based on this 1,000-year-old, really solid, really well understood tech.
Right. Yeah. The form factor at the end of the day is still something that people, interact with very regularly.
Yeah.
Taking a question from the chat here, a lot of our discussion so far has been about outward-facing technology. But where does the modernization of internal processes that also affect the public fall into civic tech, right? An example provided by the question asker is updating an archaic or inefficient workflow to respond to public inquiries and correspondence.
So the way I've thought about it often is that we got our first traction with public facing stuff, and we have part of sort of moving off of innovation and shininess is that we need to earn our way deeper in the stack to make the real differences. So if we can really get at the databases that are set up on batch write only, and therefore mean that the website is down between the hours of 5 p.m. and 8 a.m., we make a much more bigger difference if we make that service open 24 hours without causing extra staff to have to stay up all night. So there's been a bit of a theory that there's sort of, leading from public facing things where the difference is really clear, and earning our way deeper. But I agree that a lot of that should be the goal. There's a lot of cases where, as you were mentioning earlier, we wouldn't need to do as advanced UX stuff on the front end if the back end was just simpler.
The last question I'll pose to you and give you the full 5 minutes here at the end to pontificate on is this element of the goal, right? And we talked about the problem at the start of the talk, and we've talked a lot about the various different tools, techniques, use cases, policies, etc. And what I would love to hear your thoughts on is, might there be a difference in how civic technologists, whom themselves are people that do have a potentially particular skill set or particular background, but more than that, might there be a difference in goal between this approach and a more traditional approach within government? As an example, I pose to you the goal of, furthering, being a prudent spender of taxpayer dollars.
Right.
Versus the taxpayer dollars are here to be spent for effective public services.
Yeah, so I think those can be really interesting questions to address. And I think that technology has ignored some of that or used it, sort of leveraged it as well. Doing technology right would be a lot more efficient. There's certainly a lot of wasteful technology spending in government. And so it is, and by what I mean by that is things that are contracted and don't get launched, or, things that don't bring about the benefit that people thought it would. So
as opposed to, for instance, like just having a mainframe as a system is not necessarily a bad thing.
No, why would it be?
Yeah. Which sometimes can get people, Miriam Biloti's kill it with fire, for instance.
COBOL.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
Why are we using something so old? it's actually really interesting to think about the idea that, why shouldn't we have software that's been running in production for multiple decades as long as it's been taken care of?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you might want to move infrastructures, and I'm not on that side of the technology house, so to speak, so I don't want to speak to exactly what those thresholds are. But I think one of the theories is that government, why should government be efficient? It should be efficient to work better for the people who've decided to, especially in a democracy, we've come together to choose to do these things as a society. If there are things we want to exercise these rights, we want to receive these services, and it benefits all of us individually and as a society when those things are done well. So the big difference I think that gets introduced is not just done, but done well. The question of quality in services, in software, exists in a whole bunch of arenas, from professional pride to engagement to confidence to efficiencies. I don't take the position at all that if we put a bunch of things in software, we won't need much of a workforce. We can obviate the human element. We may be able to make some things a lot easier to do, but I tend to think of it in the vein of offering superpowers to the people who provide the services. Making it so that they don't have to do all of the easy parts and can spend their efforts on the hard parts. Making it so if I need a small thing, I need to renew a driver's license. How much effort do we want each member of the public to spend on that? How much effort do we want staff people to spend on that if it's uncomplicated? How do we use the tools that we have to make that happen for a reasonable cost, not just in money, but in energy from all sides?
I love that sentiment. I love the thoughts all behind it. And I have loved this conversation, Cyd.
Me too. Thank you for doing this.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. This has been really, really excellent. I know that we have a couple of other questions in the Q&A chat. Unfortunately, we're effectively at time here. We'll see if we can address these potentially in a follow-up. So Cyd, look forward to hearing from us, certainly, and we'll be in touch soon. And thank you so much for being here. And I'll pass it over to Emma to close us out.
Great. Thank you for joining us today, to Mark for moderating expertly, to Cyd for providing so many case studies, but also so many quotable moments. I feel like I was taking notes down. It's like, what is government leaving on the table? What are we grafting from the private sector? Just like those were like the first notes, and I'm still wrapping my head around them. I feel like those are such good questions that we all should be asking ourselves. For those interested in purchasing a physical copy or the audiobook version of a Civic Technologist practice guide, please go to Cyd Harrell's website link that's just posted in the chat. We at the partnership would like to thank you all for joining us on this Ides of March, and hope to see you at our next Author Talks event this summer with date and exact author and guest TBD, but we really look forward to continuing this series. And so thank you all for joining us.